Hello, and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from being a good start to a great one. This week, we've got Rogue 1 standing by. Anowon the Ruin Thief is a 4-mana 2/4 vampire rogue who buffs up our other rogues and mills our opponents whenever rogues deal damage to them. If at least one creature card gets milled when this happens, we'll draw a card. The wording on that ability is a little tricksy. We don't draw a card whenever any creature cards get milled in general, just through this combat trigger. And it's also only one per player. However, if we hit multiple players and each one of them mills at least one creature, that would draw us multiple cards instead of just one. Anowon's page is, naturally, filled with tons of rogues, who specialize in evasion, especially unblockability. However, his high synergy section doesn't tell the full picture of what's going on with this deck. I struggled for longer than I want to admit with tune-ups for this commander, which is pretty interesting actually, because usually tribal decks are really straightforward. In fact, in several episodes of the EDHREC podcast, we've taken a look at the data to suss out different deck versatilities and linearities. And what we've noticed is that tribal decks tend to be among the most linear decks that get brewed out there. As a quick example, if you were to compare two Atraxa decks against each other, there might not be a ton of cards in common. But if you were to compare two Edgar Markov vampire tribal decks, there would be a whole ton of overlap. Anowon is still a traditionally tribal deck, but there's a twist going on here that makes it more complicated. Almost every tribal deck is going to have an underlying sub-theme running through it. Dinosaurs, for example, have that Enrage sub-theme. Elf tribal decks will have a big mana sub-theme. Zombies often play around with Reanimation. You get the idea. It gives the tribe a unique zeal unto themselves, while also allowing you to do more with the creatures than just attack. What makes Anowon so tough here is that the rogue sub-themes are pretty mixed up at the moment. Let's find out more by just getting to the deck list. We're going to load up Anowon's average deck list from EDHREC and import it into the Architect deck building website. As always, any swaps we make to this list must either be cost neutral or help lower the price of the overall deck. Every rogue has its thorns. We're outfitted with tons of unblockable creatures here, but we're also making a lot of room in this deck to dabble in mill for profit, and that's what makes this all so complicated. Those other tribes we discussed have sub-themes that already run pretty much parallel to the pre-existing game plan. Elves making lots of mana, for instance, is just a good thing in general to help advance any deck's game plan, but one that elves can also take advantage of quite a lot. Mill, though, here for the rogues, mill is a totally different creature. Let's tackle the upgrades to this list in the following 3 ways. First, we'll discuss the matter of mill. Second, we'll make sure we know the thieves can't. And finally, we'll make a stealth roll. First up, let's talk about that mill. So, Anowon mills our enemies and gives us a chance at drawing cards if we happen to mill creatures. And this is kind of a problem. Mill is a completely different win condition that doesn't jive at all with combat damage. They might as well just be headed in completely opposite directions. We won't be defeating enemies on both of those axes at once. And I don't think that Anowon players are necessarily expecting to do that, to win with mill. Like, we can all do the math, we know that a person would die to combat damage long before they would die to mill in this case. However, when we look through the cards that people are playing with Anowon, we're seeing a lot of cards that focus on mill, and I think that that's dangerous. But like a nuanced dangerous. Consuming Aberration, for example, came in the original precon and fills the graveyard whenever we cast spells, getting bigger as we do so. And Mindcrank has been added to 41% of the over 1,000 Anowon decks, milling enemies even more whenever they lose life. Now, there are incentives for milling. For example, some of our rogues get bigger when enemies have enough cards in their graveyard, or cards like Zareth San also help us lift permanents out of the yard whenever he lands a hit. However, notice that the majority of mill payoff cards in this deck, for example Sepulchral Primordial, are not themselves rogues. Full honesty right now, I've been trying to make this Anowon video for like a month, but this stuff's real convoluted, and I think that there might be other Anowon players out there too who are also kind of struggling with this particular experience, so I'm hoping that this is just a way that we can walk through that process together. When mill is a component of this deck, the following things happen. First, any room that we give to the cards that mill or that reward us when things have been milled takes away from the room that we could give to the rogues in our rogue tribal deck. The typical tribal deck contains over 30 creatures of that tribal type, and this deck has 32 creatures. But 5 of them are not rogues, so that's only like a quarter of the deck for our commander to work with. Second, mill payoff cards offset our tempo. Anowon wants to come down to buff up a couple of rogues and have them start swinging as soon and as often as possible to hopefully increase our chance of drawing cards and, playing some more rogues. But those payoff cards for mill, like reanimation effects to nab some creatures out of the graveyard, those aren't good early. They're only good later, after the graveyard has been filled. Like, yeah, it sounds ideal for us to play a couple of quick rogues, slam Anowon down, attack, and then fill up the graveyard and use an animation effect to steal a big baddie right out of the yard. But sometimes the opposite will be true instead, where our early draws give us these reanimation effects while the graveyards are still completely empty. And because that's clogging up our hand, we don't have enough rogues to actually get the ball rolling in the first place. And before I forget, whatever creatures we're reanimating from the graveyard are probably not gonna be rogues. Like, they won't really fit in as nicely with our strategy. And not only that, but if we are abusing some enemy's graveyard in a way that is beneficial for us, and then they die, they're taking all of their cards away from the game, which means we're losing one of our most valuable assets and we're getting way knocked out of our commanding position. The third thing that happens is that our deck becomes even more dependent upon Anowon to function at all. If we've got a bunch of cards that care about graveyards and Anowon is the one that fills them, that puts even more pressure on us to prioritize his presence on the battlefield to make our deck work. And that's a situation that our opponents can definitely take advantage of, severely weakening our strategy by just making sure our commander's never allowed to stay in play and shutting off a bunch of cards in our hand. But the fourth and most important part is this. Filling enemy graveyards is super heckin' dangerous. Muldrotha, Marin, Sir Conrad, Teysa, Duretti, Kess, Lord Windgrace. There are so many commanders out there that make explicit use of their graveyard as a huge asset in their strategy. Not to mention cards that ubiquitously show up in 99s all over the place that make incidental use of the graveyard too. Eternal Witness, for example, shows up in a third of green decks. Like, no, seriously, if Anowon is looking for players to attack and fill the graveyard, I'm sitting here like, I volunteer as tribute. And to be fair, Dimir has lots of ways to take advantage of graveyards, like the Primordial I mentioned earlier, or this Bone Horde, for example, that shows up in the list too. One could make the argument that Anowon's colors might let him abuse enemy graveyards before those enemies are able to do so. But that is a tough custody battle to try and win. Not just that, but look at some of the cards that appear in this average list that help mitigate against enemy graveyards getting out of control, like Bojuka Bog and Ashiok. These are super wise inclusions because they keep those ever-popular Muldrotha players in check, but those types of effects also have direct negative synergy with other cards in this deck. I know this is a lot of preamble before we actually start cutting and adding cards, but I just didn't want to BS anyone by scooting around this issue. This is a complicated effect to work around. It's just too much to cram into a single deck. A bunch of tiny rogue creatures that have more evasion than power, plus a bunch of tribal payoff cards, which we need to make sure we have enough rogues to really make those tribal payoff cards shine, plus mill and mill payoff cards, which could potentially fuel enemy strategies, so we have to have enough payoff cards to try and abuse the graveyard more than they would, but then also graveyard control effects to try and keep that in check, even though that's a non-bow against our graveyard payoff cards, plus traditional categories like mana acceleration, card advantage, and removal. We just don't have room. Anowon is a crossroads. If you want to build around the mill or graveyards, even in small incidental bonus ways, that requires a lot more time, cards, and attention than it originally looks like, which is cool if that's the path you want to go down, but it requires a lot of commitment, including potentially eating away at the space for rogues in this rogue tribal deck. So you have to be willing to make really, really hard cuts. After spending a month playtesting and researching this commander, I think the mill is just an enormous red herring. There are other commanders that are better suited to take advantage of incidental mill than this one here, which is totally okay. Anowon, for our purposes, can be a really cool tribal buff that occasionally lets us test the odds by maybe drawing some extra cards after combat. And there are a couple of rogues that like it if graveyards are big, but the graveyards being big themselves is not going to be make or break for our strategy. But best of all, by removing mill and mill reward effects from this deck, we're making room for another potential strategy that Anowon could take advantage of instead. Before we get there though, we actually gotta cut some of these cards. For some of these, I'm gonna swap in lands, because that 33 right here is, it's really stressing me out. See what I was saying about there not being enough room in the deck? Anyway, Consuming Aberration, out. Lazov, out. Even if he copies some big gold creature, it won't be a rogue. Sepulchral Primordial, love you friend, but see ya in the next life. Extract from Darkness, get extracted from this deck. Bone Horde, sayonara. Whisper Steel Dagger, goodbye. This card is so weird anyway. That is so much mana to try and make that effect work. Court of Cunning, the Monarchy is neat, but if we want the Monarchy, we've got other cards that we could play instead. This also means I'm losing Drown in the Lock. It just pairs poorly with Ashiok. And last but not least, Sir Conrad. Oh, Conrad, you're my personal favorite commander, but you're not a rogue, so you... Wait, this is weird. Let me try that again. I can't bring myself to cut Sir Conrad. He's too magnificent. He's so beautiful. All right, you know what? Conrad can stay. I'm still leaving Mindcrank out though. Just because I'm keeping Connie doesn't mean I'm letting Mindcrank stay. Believe me, I have a Conrad deck. I know 3000% how stunning that combo is. I just also know how hard it would be to actually assemble here. Plus, I've been the beneficiary of lone Mindcranks in the past when I was playing Marin or something like that, which let me absolutely take over a game by letting me fill my own graveyard to my heart's content. Mindcrank is a dangerous card for us in our deck unless and until we have out this non-rogue creature, and that type of precarity, it's just not really what we're about. And I added like 3 lands, including a Path of Ancestry, because it's really cheap right now. Thank goodness too, that land count's looking so much better. Alright, that was a lot for Section 1, so let's move to Section 2 and add some more stuff in. The only way we're gonna get what we want is if we're fluent in the Thieves' Cant. We need more rogues, plain and simple. There just aren't enough here. I mentioned before that there are 27 rogues in the average deck, and yeah, it's just not enough. At that rate, Anowon's going to be checking his watch, waiting for his friends to arrive. There are 2 key points I want to highlight here as we're upgrading the members of our guild, though. Budget and evasion. I want to add more rogues here, but before I can, I'm looking up at that Bitter Blossom and its cost of like $40, and no, it's popular in this deck because it makes rogue tokens, but this card is more expensive than Anowon's original precon. I'm also not convinced that its price is commensurate to its power level in EDH, or even in this deck. It takes a while before it starts to produce bodies that we can attack with. In any case, I'm chopping it here because I want to highlight some better places that rogue players could put their money if they want to upgrade. And the rogues I recommend adding? Well, there are 2 kind of pricey ones here, Thada Adel the Acquisitor of Soul Rings and Keeper of the Keys. They're budging up on the spendy side though, so a more budget-friendly ad that I'll go for instead is Looter Ilkor. I almost never see Shadow in EDH. This card is a cert to hit whenever we want it to. I'll also make sure to put Latchkey Fairy back into the list too. It was 1 card away from making the cut in the average deck list, but since we have more room now, it slots comfortably back in. It looks like Marsh Flitter also got budged out, which is really surprising because it's 3 rogues for 1. Only the Flitter itself has practical evasion, but the numbers here are still just great for us. I'll also include Inkfathom Infiltrator, though it's not a hyper-budget card. It snuck up a smidge in price, but it also sneaks up on our enemies perfectly. If that one's not a price you like though, Death Cult Rogue is 1 more mana, but also near impossible to block too. Now, it's not all fun and games. I actually am going to cut a rogue here because I don't think it does quite enough on the evasion front. Master Thief. He temporarily steals an artifact, but he's tough to actually land any hits on an opponent, and he doesn't maintain control long enough or strong enough here. Alright, things are looking good, but there's still a little more polishing we can do here. Make a stealth roll, everyone. It's time for Section 3. I hinted earlier that I might have an alternative sub-theme instead of Mill that our rogue friends can explore, and I want to get to that, but while we're here, I also want to make sure that we upgrade the gear in our lockpicking toolkit to make sure that our backstabby bunch can survive in the shadows. First, this removal suite is pretty rough. Murder I'm swapping straight across for Go for the Throat. Price of Fame is a little bit better maybe, but I'm just exchanging it for Reality Shift. These cards are just way more reliable. That Ingarrick's Wake is about to have its own wake too. 9 mana? No ma'am. This deck's mana curve makes that practically uncastable. I'll swap it for my favorite budget board wipe, Deadly Tempest. I've KO'd players with this spell before, which is really hilarious, but it's also just a solid piece of work. The times we cast board wipes are the times when we've got like nothing in play, so this is also a splendidly one-sided spell. One will actually stand a chance of casting. Soul Manipulation and Silumgar's Command are next. As modal spells go, these just do not really impress me. Let's cut them and make some room. I also just don't love Aetherize. Fogs are cool, and this blasts tokens apart, it's true, but I don't want to bounce someone's Eternal Witness or Craterhoof back to their hand, you know? I'd rather use either Spouts. 1 more mana, but it's some hardcore tempo trouble. However, speaking of attacking, I think it's time we address that sub-theme situation and figure out a way to flesh it out in a better direction than Mill. What are all those prowl cards really all about? And the reconnaissance mission effects? They're all about sneaking through enemy lines. Our rogues attack, often and freely. They almost never get stopped in combat. They're all just so evasive. Tiny, but evasive. That's why the prowl spells are such a cool thing here after all. Our sub-theme should focus on that unique aspect of rogues. Why focus on mill when we could focus on their evasiveness? Coastal Piracy, come join those other on-hit draw enchantments. Mask of Memory, get in here too. We have so many evasive creatures that it would be a shame not to take advantage of that. All we need is a tiny poke and that will proc cool effects for us. I'll also swap out that old military intelligence card right across for Charticourse. I love this card generally, but it's also just really efficient here in a deck full of creatures that attack this often. I'm not quite done though. The tiniest pinprick from a rogue is all we need, so I'm throwing Quietus Spike into the mix. This deck needs a little more firepower, and this spike makes our tiny 1/1s extremely dangerous. It's not just about making contact though, it's also just about going unblocked. It's not a rogue, but Inkfathom Witch is a cool piece of work. Now, sadly, we have to face the truth that some of the best on-hit effects are very not budget. Swords, axes, jites, extraordinary cards to abuse with creatures that are guaranteed to slip through in combat over and over and over. They're great, but they're pricey as all get out. And let's not forget great tribal buff cards like Coat of Arms, Door of Destinies, or Vanquisher's Banner that any tribal deck can abuse too, especially this one. None of these cards are super budget friendly, but I want to put these out here as an encouragement for Anowon players who grow more comfortable with the deck and begin to consider more luxuriant upgrades. Mill is a tricky business, but tiny creatures that pack a ton of punch whenever they poke opponents who cannot ever block them, that's what's up. It takes the pressure off of Anowon to do all the heavy lifting, and it gives our rogue something awesome to do even when he's not around. I'm gonna finish up with a final recommendation that is more budget friendly and which perfectly captures the rogue's trademark move. That's the card Teferi's Veil. Whenever our creatures attack, they phase out of existence until our next turn, ready to attack again then. Good luck using a board wipe to get rid of them. This is the ultimate sneak attack card. And there we have it. You can find the full list in the description below with the cuts in the maybe board. I hope this has been helpful, and if Anowon is the one for you and you've got other tricky cards you want to share with your fellow rogues, make sure you leave those suggestions in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.